For 12 years, Baek Do-hyun, the iron-fisted ruler of the Baek Syndicate, lived with a silent death sentence. His enemies called him a god. His doctors called him a dead end. In a world where bloodline is everything, he was a king without a kingdom to leave behind. Then came Dawn B. Swihart, the woman hired to clean the cold marble of his estate, the shadow who saw the man behind the monster. One night of forbidden proximity was supposed to be a forgotten lapse in judgment. But now, the woman who folds his laundry has just placed his hand on her stomach. The miracle he couldn't buy with billions is growing inside a servant, and his enemies just found the one weakness that can bring his empire to its knees. Stay until the end to see how the infertile boss burns the world down to protect his only heir. Please like and subscribe to this channel as you follow the story. The heavy bronze doors of the Baek private study remained sealed at exactly 11 p.m. on a Friday night, a time when the world's most powerful man was usually untouchable. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive sandalwood and the sharp, clinical smell of a freshly opened medical file. Baek Do-hyun sat in the shadows, his tailored suit jacket discarded, staring at the words "zero viability," as if he could execute the paper for treason. For him, the silence of the room was the sound of his lineage dying. The silence didn't break, it shifted. Dawn B. Swihart entered with the rhythmic, practiced calm of someone who was meant to be invisible. She didn't bow as low as the others. She didn't avert her eyes. As she set the tea service down, her hand lingered a second too long near his. In the high-security heart of Seoul's most feared conglomerate, where assassins couldn't get within a mile, a maid in a crisp uniform had just successfully breached the boss's final defense. She wasn't there to clean. She was there to change the course of history. The digital clock on the mahogany desk flickered to 11 p.m., its crimson glow reflecting off the polished surface of a glass of whiskey that remained untouched. Baek Do-hyun sat in the high-backed leather chair, the undisputed king of a concrete empire that stretched from the neon-drenched docks of Incheon to the gleaming glass towers of Gangnam. To the outside world, he was a predator of absolute precision, a man who had survived 3 assassination attempts and dismantled 4 rival syndicates before his 35th birthday. But tonight, the silence of his private study felt less like peace and more like a tomb. Before him lay a single sheet of ivory paper, embossed with the seal of Seoul's most prestigious private hospital. He didn't need to read the words again. They were already seared into his mind like a brand. Zero viability. The result of a jagged scar across his lower abdomen, a souvenir from a blade meant to take his life a decade ago. It hadn't killed him then, but the report confirmed it had killed his future. Do-hyun was the last of the Baek line, a lineage that had survived wars and revolutions, only to meet its end in the sterile quiet of this room. The weight of it was suffocating. In his world, a boss without an heir was a boss with a target on his back. The elders were already whispering, their loyalty fraying like old silk as they looked for a successor among his ambitious, bloodthirsty cousins. He was a god to his men, a nightmare to his enemies. And yet, he was biologically hollow. He stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city he ruled. The lights of Seoul twinkled like fallen stars, indifferent to the fact that the man who controlled them was a dead end. He felt the coldness of the glass against his forehead, a stark contrast to the burning frustration in his chest. He had built a fortress to keep the world out, but he had inadvertently built a cage that would die with him. The heavy door creaked open, a sound so soft it would have been missed by anyone else. Do-hyun didn't turn. He didn't have to. The scent of lavender and fresh linen preceded her, the only scent in this house that didn't smell of gunpowder or expensive scotch. Dawn B. Swihart entered, her movements a rhythmic, practiced dance of invisibility. She carried a silver tray with a fresh pot of oolong tea, her expression poised and unreadable. She set the tray down with a quiet clink, her dark eyes briefly catching the reflection of the medical report on the desk. In that split second, the power dynamic of the room shifted. Do-hyun, the man who held the lives of thousands in his hands, felt a strange, primal tremor of vulnerability. He was the sun at the center of a violent galaxy, but as Dawn adjusted the porcelain cup, her quiet confidence felt like a gravity he couldn't escape. He was the master of the house, but as he looked at her, he realized he was the only one in the room truly alone. Dawn B. Swihart did not move with the frantic, bowed energy of the other household staff. While the rest of the attendants seemed to vanish into the wallpaper the moment Do-hyun entered a room, Dawn occupied the space with a stillness that was almost confrontational. She moved through the cold, cavernous halls of the Beck estate like a ghost who refused to be haunted, her spine straight and her steps measured. As she approached the desk to retrieve the used tea service, her presence did not flicker even under the weight of his localized, lethal intensity. Do-hyun watched her from the shadows of his chair. He was a man accustomed to being feared. His very gaze was a weapon that made seasoned killers stutter and look away. Yet, as Dawn reached across the mahogany desk, dangerously close to the medical report that declared him a dead end, she didn't falter. She didn't offer the submissive, downcast eyes that he demanded of the world. Instead, she worked with a quiet confidence that felt like a silent challenge to his authority. "The tea is cold, Master Beck," she said, her voice a calm, low melody that cut through the oppressive silence of the study. It wasn't an apology, it was an observation. He turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Then take it away," he replied, his tone like grinding stones. Most people would have scrambled to comply, but Dawn simply nodded, her dark eyes meeting his for a heartbeat longer than was socially permissible for a servant. In that brief contact, Do-hyun felt a jolt of something he hadn't experienced in years: curiosity. There was a hidden power in her gaze, a depth that suggested she was seeing far more than just a boss in a tailored suit. She was seeing the fracture in his armor. She reached for the tray, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to vibrate with a forbidden closeness. The scent of her, something earthy and warm, like rain on dry soil, mingled with the sterile air of his isolation. He realized then that she was the only person in his life who didn't treat him like a monster or a god. To her, he was simply a man in a dark room. As she turned to leave, her uniform crisp and her poise unshaken, Do-hyun found himself following the line of her shoulders until the door clicked shut. She was supposed to be invisible, a tool for the upkeep of his luxury, but in the wake of his diagnosis, she was the only thing in the house that felt truly alive. The king was disarmed, not by an assassin's blade, but by the unwavering eye contact of the woman who swept his floors. The following night, the storm that had been brewing over the Han River finally broke, lashing the windows of the study with a rhythmic, violent persistence. Do-hyun stood by the fireplace, the medical report now a crumpled ball of waste in the grate, his mind a chaotic loop of the word extinction. He heard the door open, but he didn't move. He expected the soft clink of porcelain, the quiet retreat of a servant. Instead, he heard the heavy click of the deadbolt. He turned, his eyes flashing with a lethality that usually brought men to their knees. Dawn stood there, her classic maid's uniform pristine, but her posture had shed its subservient mask. She didn't bow. She walked directly into his personal space, her eye contact so intense it felt like a physical weight. "You've been staring at that lie for 3 days," she said, her voice devoid of its usual formal lilt. "Get out," Do-hyun hissed, his hand gripping the mantel until his knuckles turned white. "You forget your place, Dawn." Instead of retreating, she stepped closer, forcing him back until his shoulders hit the cold stone of the fireplace. The forbidden closeness was suffocating, the air thick with the scent of ozone and her warmth. In a move that defied every law of his world, she reached out and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her hand guiding his toward her own body. "My place is wherever I choose to be," she whispered, her face inches from his. "And right now, my place is keeping the Beck name alive." She pressed his palm flat against her lower abdomen. Do-hyun's eyes closed instinctively, his breath hitching as his world tilted on its axis. He expected to feel nothing but the fabric of her apron, but beneath the layers, he felt a faint, rhythmic pulse, a heat that defied the zero viability he had accepted as his fate. "I am not the last of my line," he breathed, the words trembling with a mixture of terror and sudden, violent hope. "No," Dawn replied, her gaze never wavering as she held him pinned against the wall, the servant now the master of his destiny. "You aren't the last of your line, Do-hyun. You're just the beginning of mine. I didn't come here to clean your floors. I came to carry your crown." The revelation hit him with the force of an explosion. The cold, calculated boss of the Beck syndicate was gone, replaced by a man disarmed and reeling. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the hidden power he had sensed from the start. His world hadn't just collapsed. It had been razed to the ground so that something new could be built in its place. He was no longer a ghost in a suit. He was a father, and the woman holding him captive was the only person who could save him from his own extinction. The transition from impossible to undeniable required a bridge built of science, and for Baek Do-hyun, that bridge was Dr. Han. By 2 a.m., the syndicate's private medical wing was under a total blackout. No nurses, no digital footprints, only the hum of high-end diagnostic machinery and the suffocating tension shared by 3 people. Do-hyun stood by the reinforced glass, his silhouette sharp against the clinical white light, while Dawn sat on the edge of the examination table. She remained as she always was, poised, intense, and entirely unimpressed by the wealth surrounding her. Dr. Han, a man who had stitched together Do-hyun's shattered body more times than he cared to remember, stared at the ultrasound monitor with an expression bordering on religious awe. He moved the transducer with trembling fingers, his eyes darting between the graining screen and the medical records he had maintained for a decade. "It is statistically impossible," Han whispered, the sound echoing in the sterile room. "The scarring from the Incheon incident was absolute, Do-hyun. There was no path, no chance." And yet, Dawn's voice cut through the doctor's disbelief. "The evidence is right there." Do-hyun stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the flickering pulse on the screen. It was a tiny, rhythmic spark of life, a defiant middle finger to the biological death sentence he had carried. The reality hit him with a physical force that made his breath hitch. It wasn't just a claim anymore. It was a heartbeat. "Explain it," Do-hyun commanded, his voice a low growl that demanded a logic his world could understand. Dr. Han adjusted his glasses, his face pale. "Spontaneous regeneration is rare, almost mythical, but in cases of extreme physical trauma followed by years of cellular recovery, sometimes the body finds a way. A 1 in a billion alignment of timing and biology." He paused, looking at Dawn with a new, fearful respect. "But more than that, it requires the right genetic compatibility. This isn't just a miracle, Do-hyun. It's a perfect match." The wonder in the room was quickly replaced by a cold, sharpened focus. Do-hyun turned to Dawn, his mind already shifting from the shock of fatherhood to the logistics of war. If this was true, and the monitor didn't lie, then every moment she had spent as a maid in his house was a security failure of catastrophic proportions. "How?" Do-hyun asked, his eyes narrowing as he stepped into her space. "How does a perfect match find her way into my service exactly when my lineage is at its breaking point? Who sent you, Dawn?" The hunt had begun. The miracle had given Do-hyun a future, but it had also painted a target on the estate. As Dawn looked back at him, her eyes burning with a hidden power, Do-hyun realized that the mystery of how she arrived was just as dangerous as the child she carried. He had found his heir, but he might have also invited his most sophisticated enemy into his bed. The transition happened before the sun rose. Do-hyun watched from the shadows of the landing as Dawn's meager belongings were moved from the damp, communal servant quarters in the basement to the sprawling, sun-drenched sanctuary of the East Wing. It was a relocation that shattered 3 generations of household protocol. The East Wing was Do-hyun's inner sanctum, a place where even his most senior lieutenants required an invitation to tread. By placing a maid there, not as a worker, but as a resident, he had effectively declared a state of emergency within the estate's walls. The air in the house turned brittle. As Dawn walked through the grand foyer, no longer carrying a tray or a cleaning kit. The forbidden closeness between the master and the servant became a visible, pulsing scandal. The head housekeeper, a woman who had served the Beck family for 40 years, stood frozen by the marble pillars, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. Whispers traveled like wildfire through the vents. The boss had lost his mind. The sterile king had been bewitched by the invisible woman. Do-hyun ignored the tremors of dissent. He stood in the doorway of her new suite, watching as she touched the silk hangings with a wary, quiet confidence. She didn't look like a woman who had won the lottery. She looked like a general surveying a new front line. "You'll have your own security detail," Do-hyun stated, his voice a low vibration that seemed to fill the room. "And a private chef. Nothing enters this wing without being scanned." Dawn turned, her dark eyes reflecting the morning light. "You're building a cage, Do-hyun. Just because the bars are gold doesn't make it a home." He moved into her space, the distance between them evaporating until the emotional tension was a physical heat. He reached out, his thumb tracing the sharp line of her jaw. "It's not a cage. It's a fortress. In this house, you were a ghost. Out there, now that they know what you carry, you are a target." The power reversal was complete. He was no longer just her employer, and she was no longer his staff. They were tethered by a biological miracle that the rest of the world would view as a provocation. As he looked down at her, the scandal of their proximity felt insignificant compared to the raw, terrifying instinct to protect her. The servant in control had disarmed the boss, but in doing so, she had joined him in the crosshairs. Every servant watching from the hallways, every guard whispering in the courtyard, was now a potential leak. The Beck estate was no longer a home. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The fragile piece of the East Wing was shattered not by an explosion, but by a single high-resolution photograph. Do-hyun stood in the surveillance hub of the estate, his eyes fixed on a grainy image captured by a drone hovering near the perimeter. It showed Dawn standing by the window of her new suite, her profile illuminated by the moon. Beside him, his head of intelligence, a man who had tracked international threats for decades, tapped a key to run a cross-reference search through the global Interpol databases, not for domestic workers, but for high-value targets. The screen flickered, and the name, Dawn B. Swihart, disappeared, replaced by a file redacted in 3 different languages. The woman who had been scrubbing his floors was identified as Adana Dawn Okoro, the disowned heiress of the Lagos-based syndicate, a rival international faction that had vanished after a bloody coup 5 years ago. She wasn't a commoner who had lucked into a miracle. She was underworld royalty, in hiding, a princess of the shadows who had sought refuge in the one place no one would think to look, the home of the most dangerous man in Seoul. The realization hit Do-hyun with a cold, sharp clarity. The quiet confidence he had admired wasn't the pride of a servant. It was the ingrained authority of a woman born to rule. He left the hub and strode toward her quarters, the air around him vibrating with a new, dangerous tension. He found her standing on the balcony, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if she could see across the ocean to the empire she had lost. "Adana," he said, the name tasting like iron in his mouth. Dawn didn't flinch. She turned slowly, the poised and intense mask she wore as a maid finally falling away to reveal the predator beneath. "I wondered how long it would take your men to look past the uniform," she said, her voice dropping into a regal, commanding register. "You didn't just hide here," Do-hyun stated, closing the distance until their forbidden closeness felt like a standoff between 2 warring nations. "You used my house as a bunker. You used me as a shield. I used what I had to survive," she countered, her eyes flashing with a hidden power that matched his own. "But the child I carry is no tactic, Do-hyun. He is the union of 2 empires. And right now, my father's enemies and your syndicate's rivals have both realized that the heir to everything is currently sitting in a single room in Seoul." The stakes had officially transcended the walls of the estate. It was no longer a domestic scandal. It was a geopolitical time bomb. Do-hyun realized that the woman he had moved to his private wing to protect was actually the most dangerous person he had ever met. He had thought he was the master of the house, but in the presence of underworld royalty, he was merely the host of a war that had just arrived at his doorstep. The sanctuary of the East Wing was violated not by weapons, but by the arrival of the Council of Elders. They moved through the estate like ancient, predatory birds, draped in traditional silks and carrying the weight of a century of syndicate law. These were the men who had sanctioned wars and blessed executions, and to them, the blood purity of the Beck lineage was a sacred doctrine that could not be stained by an outsider, especially not one whose history was tied to a foreign throne. Do-hyun met them in the Great Hall, a cavernous space of granite and shadow. The air was cold, the central heating powerless against the literal chill brought by the 5 men seated at the long obsidian table. The elder chairman, a man whose skin was as thin and brittle as ancient parchment, tapped a skeletal finger against the intelligence file on Dawn. A miracle is not always a blessing, Do-hyun, the chairman rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across stone. To the world, you are the last of the Beck. To us, this child is a contamination. A mix of a Korean king and a fallen African queen is a hybrid the syndicate cannot support. Do-hyun's jaw tightened, his hand resting on the hilt of the ceremonial blade at his hip. He is my blood. He is the first heartbeat this family has seen in a generation. He is a liability. Another elder interjected, his eyes narrow and cold. Her past is a magnet for international steel. Her presence here invites the Okoro wars into our streets. To keep the Beck line pure, the vessel must be discarded. The word discarded hung in the air like a death sentence. The verdict was clear. To save the empire, Dawn had to be disposed of. The elders weren't asking. They were issuing a decree. They viewed her not as a woman or a mother, but as a biological error that needed to be erased. The power dynamic shifted as Do-hyun leaned over the table, his shadow stretching long and dark across the elders. You speak of purity as if it's a virtue, but it has only brought us to the edge of extinction. You want to dispose of the woman who did what all your prayers and doctors couldn't. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. If any of you touches her, I won't just end your lives. I will burn the Beck name into the ground and ensure that I truly am the last of my line. There will be no syndicate for you to rule over from your graves. He turned and walked out, leaving the council in a stunned, murderous silence. He had chosen the maid over the mandate, the miracle over the map. But as he strode toward the East Wing, he knew he had just declared war on his own blood. The elders would not retreat. They would move in the shadows, and the next threat to Dawn's life wouldn't come from a rival gang, but from within the very walls built to protect her. The storm that had been rattling the windows for days finally tore the sky open, releasing a deluge that drowned the city in gray. Inside the Beck estate, the atmosphere was even more volatile. The power flickered once, then died entirely, plunging the marble corridors into a terrifying, velvet darkness. Before the backup generators could kick in, the silence was shattered by the rhythmic thwip-thwip of suppressed rifles. The elders had not waited for a second conversation. They had opened the gates for a joint strike force of internal purists and external rivals. Do-hyun was in the hallway outside the East Wing when the first breach occurred. He pulled his weapon, his mind racing with the singular goal of reaching the heavy oak doors of Dawn's suite. But the doors opened before he got there. Dawn stepped out, no longer the invisible woman in a maid's uniform. She had traded her apron for a tactical vest, her hair pulled tight, a sleek submachine gun held with the familiar ease of someone who had survived the streets of Lagos and the boardrooms of empires. The back stairwell is compromised, she said, her voice a steady anchor in the chaos. They aren't here to kidnap me, Do-hyun. They're here to erase us. He didn't waste time asking where she'd hidden the gun. Stay behind me, he commanded, but as a grenade detonated in the foyer below, sending a shockwave through the floorboards, Dawn moved with him in perfect, lethal synchronization. They fought side by side through the gallery, a pair of displaced monarchs defending their future. Do-hyun moved with the brutal, practiced efficiency of a mafia boss, but Dawn was a revelation of hidden power. She covered his blind spots with military precision, her eyes cold and focused. The forbidden closeness they had shared in the study was now forged into a tactical alliance. As they were pinned down behind a marble balustrade, bullets chipping away at the stone, Do-hyun looked at the woman he once thought was just a servant. She was reloading a magazine with steady fingers, her poise unshaken even as the world burned around them. "You're a hell of a maid, Adana," he grunted, firing a suppressive burst over the edge. She flashed a sharp, dangerous smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You should see me when I'm actually working." The emotional tension between them had reached a breaking point, transformed into a raw, primal energy. They weren't just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for the miracle growing inside her. In the heat of the siege, the master and the servant had ceased to exist. There were only two survivors, back to back, holding the line against a world that wanted them extinct. As the final wave of attackers rushed the stairs, Do-hyun realized that he had never been more disarmed than he was in this moment. Not by his enemies, but by the absolute, terrifying strength of the woman at his side. The smoke from the firefight hung in the grand hall like a funeral shroud, mingling with the scent of ozone and spilled blood. The rebellion had been swift, but the retaliation had been absolute. Do-hyun stood at the center of the wreckage, his suit jacket gone and his shirt stained crimson, but his presence had never been more commanding. At his feet lay the broken symbols of the old world, the Council of Elders, disarmed and forced to their knees by the very guards who had once taken their orders. He didn't look at the defeated men first. He turned to the woman beside him. Dawn stood with her submachine gun lowered but still gripped firmly, her breathing shallow and her eyes burning with the fire of a survivor. The forbidden closeness that had started as a scandal had become the bedrock of a new empire. Without a word, Do-hyun reached out and took her hand. His fingers interlaced with hers, a public, unbreakable bond between the mafia king and the woman who had rewoken his soul. The elder chairman looked up, his face twisted in a mask of fading arrogance. "You have destroyed a century of tradition for a maid," he spat, his voice trembling with a final, desperate venom. "The syndicate will never accept a bloodline born of betrayal." Do-hyun stepped forward, pulling Dawn with him into the light. The power reversal was no longer a secret behind closed doors. It was the law of the land. "The syndicate is no longer yours to worry about," Do-hyun said, his voice echoing through the marble pillars with a chilling finality. "You govern by the fear of extinction. I will govern by the strength of what we have built." He looked out at the assembled soldiers and staff who had survived the night. They watched him with a mixture of awe and terror, realizing they were witnessing the birth of something entirely new. Do-hyun raised their joined hands, a gesture of absolute unity that bridged two continents and two legacies. "The era of the Beck as you knew it is dead," he announced, his gaze sweeping across the room. "We are no longer defined by the purity of our past, but by the protection of our future. This woman is not a servant. She is the mother of the next Beck ruler, and she is the queen of this house. Anyone who cannot kneel to that will find their own lineage ending tonight." A heavy, profound silence followed, broken only by the sound of the storm outside finally beginning to recede. One by one, the guards lowered their heads. Then, the head housekeeper, the woman who had been the most vocal critic of the scandal, slowly dropped to one knee, followed by the rest of the survivors. Do-hyun felt a squeeze from Dawn's hand, a silent acknowledgement of the new reign they had just inaugurated. He was no longer the last of his line, and she was no longer in hiding. Together, they stood over the ruins of the old guard, a king and a queen who had turned a medical impossibility into a dynasty. The king was no longer disarmed. He was finally, for the first time in his life, complete.